My name is Dan. I'm a product manager at the Canadian Digital Service. And first thing first, hello. It's really good to be back home. I spent the last 2 years in Ottawa, and I was trying to explain to people where Edmonton was, and trying to really champion hey, there's more to the west than Vancouver. There's a slice in the Edmonton. Myself with two other fellows, so it's Raluca, who's our designer in the middle, Leon as our developer. The three of us worked with Veterans Affairs Canada. And what do? We basically help Veterans Affairs Canada serve over 300,000 veterans and their families. And that's about 1 million people if you think about it. What they had was a lot of incredible programs and benefits to help veterans. But in order to understand which benefit you had or which benefit you could qualify for, you needed a 4-hour intensive training. That was just on the staff side. So our mission was to condense that down into a web product or something that could be used among all the different veterans and staff so that they could better understand the veterans. But other things that we did along the way was that we made it both in French and in English. And we worked at helping Veterans Affairs build a sustainable team to carry this on. So it wasn't just hey, here's this neat thing, drop mic and leave. We actually worked really hard to help them build a team. And so today I'm just going to tell you a little bit of the story of not the thing that we built, but the things that we learned along the way to build the team that continues to build this thing. So who among from the Edmontons remembers this sign? Yeah, so for the people who are not from Edmonton, back in 2016, this thing popped up, and there was a lot of talk about this, because we were trying to find our identity as an Edmonton city, where we Austin, keep it weird or not. And then all of a sudden someone said, take a risk. It's the most Edmonton thing you can do. And to give some context, in 2016, I was working with a research group in Manitoba to work on Aboriginal health, specifically in substance abuse and mental health risk assessments. And there, we were working really well and we were gathering quite a lot of progress, but we were kind of facing some limits. And at that time, I didn't quite understand why we weren't able to expand. And then very quickly, I started to understand that it was a government thing. I did not understand the context of it. I understood the technology, I understood the problem, but then where it was being applied was a very different scenario. So I was one of the lucky few to get selected as a product manager. And the first thing you do whenever you start a new thing is what is this like? And I heard lots of commentary about, oh, Ottawa's colder, or it's the workload is different and all these other things like that. And this is a picture I took during my train ride from Toronto to Ottawa. And for me, this felt a lot like home. It was oh, there's prairies, there's farm fields. I can handle this. Then I got to Ottawa. So Ottawa is about the same size of Edmonton. Actually, I don't know if we all know this. There are about around 1 million people, and it's a government city, just like Edmonton. They claim that they're a winter city, which they get. But there's a few things that are different. One of the anecdotal differences was last winter, I noticed something very different about their cars. And everyone's saying oh, how cold it is in Edmonton. And it's hey, where do you plug in your car? And everyone in Ontario and Ottawa was what do you mean? How do you plug in a car? And any from Edmonton will know you have to plug in your car for at least 8 hours or it will die. It will freeze as a solid block. And that, again, was one of those different ways that we started to learn about how people view winter, how people view the problems between out in the west and out east. And I thought I could bring a lot of that kind of not just Western flavor, but just some of the experiences that we learned. And that started my whole idea of hey, things aren't that different. There are some things that we can bring to the table from the Western context, from a technology context, into the government side. So as a product manager, one of my main focuses is to set the vision and then set a strategy. But my strategy typically is to narrow it down very quickly. Find a very specific group of people to talk to and just laser focus, build it for them, and then expand it out. Once we landed in Ottawa, the first few questions was hey, what are you going to do about French audiences? They have to be served. What about accessibility requirements? What about all these other technology things? And your niche goes from tiny little laser slice to giant moonbeam. And it's really hard for you to adopt a niche strategy. So what was the other tool that I had? And one of the tools that I learned the most was about how to become more inclusive. And that's something that I've learned a lot during my work here in Edmonton and during my work in the technology side. And so what does that mean? Well, right before the fellowship, I had this fortunate opportunity to go to the Pier 21 exhibit in Halifax. And there was this artist that was trying to amass this large quilt. And she did it in an inclusive way. She asked people who came into the exhibit to select a patch and tell their story around it. And then she set the vision of this is what we're trying to build. This is how you fit into it. And I thought that was actually very similar to what we ended up doing. So we found our strategy to be split into 3 different types of inclusiveness that I'll walk you through. The first one is have an inclusive mission. So the 3 fellows, us 3, from the get-go, we were we want to bring as many people to the table as possible. By bringing as many people to the table as possible, that means that we are going to be people-centered. We are no longer going to have us and them. We are actually going to make us a part of them or them part of us. We're trying to break down these silos, and only by doing that can we actually start to understand the nature of that problem. And when you start to actually be inclusive from the start, then it makes making inclusive teams pretty easy. And so now there's a couple definitions of inclusive teams that you might think of. One is just having different people like developers, designers, product managers, and even having, in our case, we had French-speaking people, English-speaking people. We had a whole variety of it. But let's dig a little level deeper. Inclusive teams doesn't just mean having multiple people. It means making them work together. And one of the things that we learned on our team that worked really well was doing cross-disciplinary paired programming or cross-disciplinary design. And what does that mean is so in the tech world, you might hear the word paired programming, and that's typically when you have 2 developers share one keyboard. And the dialogue between the 2 of them, they can actually start to question each other and help work on problems. So we took that and expanded one next level, was that we put a developer and a designer, so a coder and a non-coder together, and they worked on coding issues and they worked on design issues. And the benefit of what happened there was that the developers started to understand the constraints of the developers started to understand the constraints of the design, and design understood the constraints of the developers. That may seem super obvious, but what that helped us do was leverage a lot of that crosstalk that happened there, and we were able to build things much quicker. We actually built things more without making as many mistakes. Some of the things that were obvious to one were caught right away. So some accessibility issues were just understood right away. It's that can't be done, but you can do it this way. And so making teams inclusive and making their work inclusive sounds at first more time, but in fact it saves you a ton of time in the end, and it actually builds not just a better product, but a better team, because everyone starts to share their perspective of the problem, and you get a better view of it. And finally, one of the last things that we talk about, at least at Canadian Digital Service and Code for Canada, I love, is that we're talking about inclusive partners. And so what does inclusive partners mean? Again, something that I've learned and seen a lot is that typically you get a lot of what's called client-vendor relationship, or that silo that goes between the business side and then the tech side. And this is prevalent everywhere. It's not just in corporate organizations, but in government organizations everywhere. And it sort of makes sense, but it doesn't. When you're starting to think about really how do you attack a problem, how do you really concretely solve a problem and bring everyone together, you can no longer assume that one side has all the answers, ships it over to the other side, and then back and forth. That type of way doesn't work. So when we were working with Veterans Affairs, we actually meant by being inclusive, we invited the directors, the managers from all sorts of departments. This expanded beyond just our immediate partner. We talked to their comms department. We talked to their frontline staff. People who were not immediately in our stakeholder views, brought them to the table and explained the problem to them and asked them what was their perspective of the problem. And then from there, we actually leveraged that and then kept on building our thing. So what does that all result in? And let me introduce you to one of our really good friends, Gary. So at the very beginning of our fellowship, one thing you should know is Veterans Affairs headquarters is in Prince Edward Island, and we were based in Ottawa. Gary was someone who worked for Veterans Affairs that was based in Ottawa, but was not part of our stakeholder group. He was actually in charge of partnerships. But his sole task was to help us arrange for meeting rooms, equipment, all the logistics of it. And as a result, he was like, I'm very curious, like, I want to learn more about what you guys do. And so us being an inclusive team and having an inclusive mission was like, yes, Gary, totally come in. Come into our sprint plannings, our stand-ups. Don't just come and observe, be a part of it. So we made him vote on the task complexities of the things that we were working on. We brought him into research. So he came along, and again, he was not one of the stakeholders. He was doing this on his own, where he came in, sat into interviews with veterans with us. He helped us synthesize the data into this, if you can imagine, a tiny little closet room that's filled with orange and yellow stickies. And it was in doing that he actually just was like really helping us like understand the problem and just work out from a different perspective. Now, when we're talking about inclusive teams and inclusive missions, there's one slight interesting Code for Canada twist, which is the sustainability twist. You should know that the Code for Canada Fellowship is 10 months. And so we knew from the get-go that we only had 10 months with Veterans Affairs. We needed to make sure that Veterans Affairs at the end of 10 months could carry on the product. So that meant Leon, our developer, had to find his equivalent. So he had to find a developer or multiple developers that could handle the next thing that we were leaving for them. Raluca, the designer, had to find other designers. And so Veterans Affairs Canada, to their credit, found it within the organization or even hired them straight up. But a product manager, myself, there was none to be found. There was a whole new category for government that they did not quite have a classification for or any capacity to build. And so what to do? And this is a picture of at the end of our 10 months. And right before this picture, a few days before, Gary's like, as partnerships lead, he's like, hey, Dan, I want to talk about our product to the Ministry of Education. And I was like, well, that's different. But he's always been talking about bringing in other people. I was like, let's do it, Gary. Let's go. And we had barely a few days left in our fellowship. And we went to the Ministry of Education, and he's like, hey, do you mind if I just talk about this? Because they know me more than you. And you're just here. You can help support it. And I was like, totally do it. And so Gary went and walked through our product for the entire 15 minutes. He explained not only the nature of the problem, but how we attacked it, the needs of the veterans. He went so in depth that he knew every beat of this product, and he knew every need of the veteran. And here was the direct result of someone who was just brought in. And so at the end of it, I was like, Gary, you are a product manager. You know how to write these stories. You know where this product is going. You should totally become a product manager. And luckily, we were able to, with the help of our friends at Canadian Digital Service, bring that up to Veterans Affairs, and they hired their very first product manager. It's an amazing story when you think about where he came from the partnership side, outside stakeholder, to the internal one. And so again, this is that benefit of like, you get these amazing little surprises of what happens when you invite someone to the table, and not just invite them as an observer, but invite them as a contributor. Make them work with you, work the problems together. So I want to leave you with one final thing. At the very beginning of our fellowship, we learned of this phrase, change at the speed of trust. And this guided a lot of our interactions with Veterans Affairs and with fellow public servants. We understood, and they understood, that change was necessary. They understood that the things that they were working on just had to be different. It just didn't work the way it is. But how do you get there? How do you change, and how do you do that? And so we adopted a climate of trust through inclusiveness. And by being including them in, again, all of our ceremonies, as in like the sprints and all our stand-ups, we were able to start gaining their trust. We helped them understand that we're not here to replace you. We're here to help you do your work. We're here to learn from you as well. And so little by little, we invite them to come to the table and to work with us. And so I'm going to leave you with this quote here. And I'm going to say that inclusion at the first seems really daunting. It seems like a lot because you're inviting more people to come and see your unfinished work. But the payoff is amazing, and it's worth the risk, the Edmontonian risk, to come and invite people to the table. So please, I think that from my perspective, what I've learned from Edmonton, it's worth that risk to take. It's worth to include people into the product. It's worth the work to be an open, and it's definitely worth the effort to be inclusive. So thank you very much.